4th century, you had the establishment of Christianity in the Western world, the Roman world. And then that blossomed and worked itself into all of Europe during those early centuries. Afterwards, the 500s, 600s, St. Augustine, St. Gregory sent St. Augustine here to England in the 600s. Scandinavia, Germany, all of the European continent was evangelized. And with it was a great flourishing of Catholic culture. In many cases, the local governments were under the bishops. That was true in France. France was really founded by bishops. And there was a great fervor. There were many saints at that time, saintly bishops that we don't even know about. They're not in the calendar. But when you read about that history, there were very, very many saints in England, and that are obscure to us now. But it was the early Middle Ages was a very important time in the formation of Christendom. And that establishment of Christendom lasted until about 1300. What characterized Christendom was that everyone had his mind on the life of the world to come, and despised, in a good sense, had contempt for this life. That's what characterized the whole thing. If you look at what the products of the Middle Ages, the notable products of the Middle Ages, were not gadgets, were not anything that we have today, cell phones. They were plenty intelligent. They were just as intelligent as we are, no doubt about it. We have no monopoly on that. But all of their energy went into three things: theology, Gregorian chant, and cathedrals. That is what is left of the Middle Ages. They still used ox carts that the Romans did. They did not make much, and they had a few inventions, maybe, here, there, and the other place. St. Albert the Great made a automaton, something where you wind it up and it works on itself. He dabbled in those things in the 13th century. But there was not a lot of progress in any of the sciences or technology. There's a lot of engineering going on, as you can see from those cathedrals, but a lot of art. But all of it was sacred. As Cardinal Taviani said, the Middle Ages was the time when art was in the home of religion. And there is very little secular art from the Middle Ages. So you can see that their minds, the minds of society, were on the next world. Totally. And that was Christendom. That lasted for 1,000 years. 1,000 years is a long time. 1,000 years ago would have been 1200s. Right? Is that right? Am I right about that? In other words, it would have been the latter part of the Middle Ages. That's 1,000 years. That's a long time. Now, I put the end of the Middle Ages at the moment when the military envoy of Philip the Fair of France slapped Boniface VIII in the face. That was the end. It's a symbol of the end of the Middle Ages and that Christendom. His name was Nogaret. And Philip the Fair was in a fight with Boniface VIII over the taxation of the monasteries for his wars. I think it was against England, as always. And and Boniface VIII said, I don't have objection to taxation, but no excessive taxation, and any taxation has to be approved by the Holy See. Well, Philip the Fair had a fit. And he was the grandson of St. Louis, imagine. And so he sent his military, his soldiers down and met with Boniface VIII, and because Boniface was intransigent, slapped him in the face with his glove. That's a very significant thing. The 1300s and the 1400s, in that period, you see the beginning of the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance is pivotal. It really explains everything that is going on now. The Renaissance was a reawakening, you might say, of the pagan period. And the typical Renaissance man was a humanist. Now, there was a humanism that was compatible with Catholicism, and there was a very evil humanism. The humanism that was compatible was merely a study of the classics. There's nothing incompatible with the faith if you read Cicero, or if you read Virgil, or any of the other Roman authors or Greek authors, as long as they're not dirty. They were well known for writing dirty poetry, like Horace, Ovid, and Lucretius. But many of the things they wrote were not dirty. There's absolutely no offense to the faith in those things, even if they talk about the gods. But that doesn't offend the faith in the sense you understand that that is just false mythology. It's not something that's going to rot your faith out. See? And for example, St. Thomas More was a humanist in that sense. But nothing that affects the faith. However, there was the other humanism, which was a real attempt to reinvigorate the ancient paganism. That Christianity had ruined paganism, ruined the classical cultures, and that now we have to go back to these values that they had, which were horrible values. See? So it was a cultivation of man without original sin. See, man in his pure nature. That was the spirit of the Renaissance. That's why you see paintings where people are nude or almost nude in the Renaissance. And the reason is that clothing came to us because of original sin. In Genesis, they realized they were naked and they covered themselves. See, but that use of nudity shows that we're going to look at man without any reference to original sin and just according to his nature. So there was this cult of the natural, which was a total opposite of the Middle Ages, which was a cult of the supernatural. See, so there was a tremendous change in Europe in the Renaissance. It was especially prevalent in Italy and in Germany. And so you know all of the many of the 15th century popes were humanists, like Sixtus IV, who was who built the Sistine Chapel, was tainted by this culture of the Renaissance. Nicholas V also, if you read about him, this did not affect their faith or did not affect their teachings or anything like that. It just, it affected their attitudes. And then there were others who, like Pius II, who reacted very strongly against it. So in Italy, especially Florence, which was decadent at the time, Florence was very, very rich. The common currency, at least in continental Europe, was the florin, because banking was invented in Florence, and so they would make all of these gold coins, and these would be the florins. So Florence was very rich and very decadent. Usually money and decadence go very much together. They just go together. That's what happened to Rome. St. Augustine said Rome fell because of the moral decadence of the people. So, he was very clear about that. But, they just did not have the energy anymore to resist their enemies, the moral decadence. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's happening to our country. There's so much moral decadence that I don't know what will happen in the next war, let's put it that way. But in any case, you saw this turn toward the old paganism and a revival of all of the attitudes, the Epicureanism and the love of anything that is impure and pertains to the flesh. There was a great deal of prosperity in all of Europe, including Northern Europe, including England, that was not known in the Middle Ages. Italy particularly was prosperous. This was the height of Venice, trading with the East, and Genoa as well. So Italy was very much affected, but Germany as well was affected by it. You also saw the rise of nominalism, which was a philosophy in reaction to scholasticism, which said that we don't really know the essences of things, we just give things names. We see things that are similar, we give them names. And it was called nominalism. It was a type of modernism of the 15th century. And if you were, let's say, woke in the 15th century, you were a nominalist. And the place where Erfurt, I think it was a place where Martin Luther was studying, was a nominalist nest in that university. So he was a nominalist. So that again detached human beings from reality. So you didn't know any essences. So well, what do you do with the natural law then? See, if you don't really know, if we have knowledge like animals, all we see things and we give them names. It was all based on the senses. See? So it reduced man to a type of animal, that philosophy. So that was also prevalent in that early Renaissance, was the philosophy of nominalism. So this turn of the Renaissance is pivotal in understanding Vatican II, believe it or not. And I'll show you how. You had also figures like Erasmus, who he was ordained a priest in 1492, and although he was a religious, he abandoned his monastery and no longer wore his habit. He never said Mass and seldom assisted at it. This was, Germany and Italy were very much, had corrupted clergy. There was another factor, that the clergy were corrupt in Italy and in Germany, but not in England. England was doing fine at this point, from the point of view of the Catholic religion. Many monasteries, very pious. In 1496, he was sent to Paris to study. He had an abhorrence for scholasticism. See, that was typical of the time. And spent most of his time traveling. He traveled to England in 1498, where he met St. Thomas More and Collet, among others. Collet showed him how to reconcile Catholicism and humanism by abandoning scholasticism and concentrating only on sacred scripture. Now, that's exactly what Luther will do. See, the trend is that scholasticism, that is the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, essentially. And scholasticism explains through Aristotelian philosophy, which is the true philosophy, explains revelation. You take revelation and you explain the various aspects of God's nature and his existence and the incarnation, etc., by means of analogy, that is, by the analogy or comparison to created things, you understand certain things about the Creator. You see, so the scholasticism is based on that. It's very clear. It is what we call essentialist. That is, it looks at the essences of things and draws conclusions from the essences of things. It is not. It is just the opposite of nominalism. As your intellect is able to see beyond the senses. It relies upon the senses. That is, you take in things by looking at them and hearing them, but it sees the essence of the thing beyond the senses. So you know what invisible things are. Love, for example. If you talk to a dog about love, he's not going to answer you. See, but you can define love. You can say what it is. You know that there are certain ways in which love expresses itself, like gifts and you do favors for people, etc. But love is something that is immaterial in your intellect and in your will. Your will is immaterial, your intellect is immaterial. That is something that only the mind can understand and the will can do, is acts. So your will orders your body to perform certain acts that, for taking care of the sick, for example, like that. So human beings understand things that are totally immaterial. If I say to you indefectibility, you know what that means. Infallibility. Totally intellectual realities, but nonetheless realities. So you can't put your finger on indefectibility. So you can't touch it, or infallibility. See, that's an example that your mind understands things that are beyond senses. But nominalism says, no, you're just bound to senses. And therefore, forget about all of that philosophy and all of that stuff. No good. Just go to sacred scripture. Now, the problem with sacred scripture is that it is obscure in many cases. And the meaning of it has to be determined. And that's why you have the Catholic Church. That's why you have this agency set up by God to tell us what the sacred scripture means and what is revealed through sacred tradition, what it means. So, for example, St. Peter even said that the epistles of St. Paul are obscure. And so Christ set up the church to be effectively his voice in telling us what is the rule of faith, what we must believe, and what the sacred scripture means. And if you destroy that, as Luther did, that was his main error, was the destruction of the authority of the church, then what happens is exactly what happened in Protestantism. And that is that the doctrine of Luther is that you pick up the Bible, you open it up, and you read something, and the Holy Ghost will come and inspire you as to what it means. Well, if that's true, then why are there as many interpretations as there are Protestants? So that means the Holy Ghost could interpret one person to say this and another person to say its opposite, which makes no sense whatsoever, because he is the Spirit of truth. If that were true, then everyone reading the same text would believe the same thing. So when we read that our Lord said, "This is my body," at the Last Supper, the Catholic Church says we take that absolutely literally. Well, the Protestants say, no, he meant it only figuratively. Well, which is right? Obviously, the Spirit of truth is not involved here if you're relying only on personal inspiration. as Luther said. So the Lutheran heresy set up this subjectivism. That is, reality is what you make it. Even though there is something very objective in sacred scripture, it's up to you to interpret it. So you could be interpreting it this way, you could be interpreting it another way, but we all have faith. That is, we all have a confidence in God. And so you see from that dogma is trashed. You cannot have dogma that way. Everyone has his own set of dogmas. Everyone sees God differently and interprets differently. So that's why you had this tremendous multiplication of Protestant sects. So from 1517 right up until, well, even into this, Methodism in the middle of the 18th century. Right, you had a multiplication of all of these different Protestant sects because they all believed different things. And then it continued in the United States. They broke up incredibly. I think there's 250 different Protestant sects in the United States, all believing slightly different things, which of course makes no sense. Where is the truth there? And so they themselves, they're all in communion with each other. You know, if you're an Episcopalian, which is Anglicanism over there, you can go to the Presbyterian church if that's the only one in town. You could receive their communion. It doesn't matter. Everything is based on your personal relationship with God. Everything's personal. There's nothing objective. That is what Protestantism gave us. And so Protestantism, together with the Renaissance gives us this idea of humanism, man as man without God. It's not necessarily atheistic, but it considers man without God. It considers man without original sin, without his penchant for evil. And if he just follows his reason, he will be fine. And we can create a civilization based on reason alone. We don't need revelation. Now, this is the radical humanism of that time. You have, concurrent with that, you have Martin Luther giving us this subjectivism, nominalism giving us this subjectivism. So that is a big ingredient into the modern world. You're seeing it in transgenderism. You can be whatever you think you are. The basis of that is the subjectivism of nominalism and Lutheranism. Religion has a far greater impact than philosophy. Philosophy is, it's confined to universities, it's confined to intelligentsia. But religion gets down into the minds of the common people and makes a culture. Religion is always the source of culture, and so this religion of subjectivism inserted itself into the minds of probably ultimately half of Europe after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Protestantism was totally established in Northern Europe, so it inserted itself in that way. Also, another enormous contribution, if you want to call it that, of Lutheranism was the idea of salvation by faith alone. You see, the Catholic notion of salvation is merit. You must attain the state of sanctifying grace by baptism, and if you should fall, you confess and you are restored to the state of sanctifying grace. And while you're in the state of sanctifying grace, all of your good works, whatever they are, great or small, are meritorious. And that is, they cause, by God's plan, an increase of sanctifying grace, an intensification of sanctifying grace. Just like fire can be very intense or very low, so grace in the soul can be very intense or cool, you might say. So some people are great saints. The sanctifying grace is very, very intense, and it has the effects of love of God, first of all, and then a very, very strong love of neighbor, but a supernatural love of neighbor, not just some humanistic nonsense. A supernatural love of neighbor. So St. Vincent de Paul, for example, taking care of the poor. You see many saints. St. Louis, the King of France, for example, would get into a normal hospital costume and go around and do the dirtiest things, like emptying bedpans in hospitals in France, in Paris, just as a service to the poor. Nobody knew who he was, and he would do that. That's the supernatural charity, fraternal charity, that intense grace gives birth to. And so Luther said, we're all sinners. We're just sinners, and we're just going to remain sinners. And compared our justification to snow covering the dung heap. And that is that we remain sinners, but the snow is the merits of Christ, and God the Father merely looks at the snow and doesn't look at the dung. So we're covered, sort of covered up in the cloak of the merits of Christ. And the way you achieve that is merely by accepting Christ as your Savior and hoping in Him. So faith for them was hope, what we would call hope, having confidence in God. Their faith was what we would call hope. Our faith is assent to the truths revealed by God and proposed by the Catholic Church for belief. So it's an intellectual assent to dogma. For them, there is no dogma because it's up to you. And what justifies you is faith. So all the sacraments became merely faith exciters. He denied ex opere operato, which means that the sacrament works by its own power. The ceremonies of the sacraments were faith exciters. And it's by faith that you are justified. Faith alone, you're justified. And now the Catholic Church would say you need faith to be justified, but you need to have hope and charity as well. That a dead faith, simply that you believe in the state of mortal sin, that would not bring you to heaven. You must have supernatural hope, supernatural charity, which is love of God, obedience to the commandments. So that meant that any kind of striving for supernatural perfection was dead. See, you're a sinner. You are in sin. So I sound like one of those American preachers. Sin, sin, sin. You're going to be always a sinner. And you have to you have to profess that you're a sinner and then throw yourself on Christ. That's how they preach in the U.S. They have huge audiences of no, amen. And what that does is that means that you don't have to do anything else but have faith, and you're not going to be anything else than a sinner. So they got rid of religious life. Henry VIII destroyed all the monasteries in this country because religious life made no more sense. Of course, he wanted the land too, to give to his buddies in order to entice them into Protestantism, because the monasteries owned huge tracts of land all over Europe. But the religious life disappeared, whereas in the Middle Ages, religious life flourished everywhere, especially in England. I mean, there were many, many monasteries in England. It was a very, very Catholic place. France, Germany, Italy, it flourished everywhere. The religious life, that is, the pursuit of perfection in the religious life, not merely being a sinner. But Martin Luther reduced everybody to sinners. Well, what does that mean? Your mind is turned to this world. See, all you have to do is have faith. You're going to heaven if you have Protestant faith. That's taken care of. One Protestant told me, I have a reservation in heaven. So it doesn't matter what you do. If you sin, well, God forgives you. He knows you're a sinner. St. Luther said, God knows that we cannot keep the commandments. He doesn't expect it. He knows that. And this mentality inserted itself into Northern Europe. Now, if you look at the culture, say, in England, of pre-Reformation England, what do you see? You see the cathedrals. You see the remnants of a magnificent Catholic culture. You see the ruins of the monasteries. Beautiful. With the very few exceptions, you don't see any of that after the Reformation. I would say the single exception is maybe St. Paul's in London, which makes an attempt to look like a real church. But the rest of them are very plain, usually halls. There are some Protestant churches that are not too bad, but London, for example, Saint Martin's, that is near the National Gallery, or some of those typical Protestant churches in Georgian style. It's all flat. I mean, they're nice, but it's all meeting hall business, and it looks like somebody's nice home. See, all of the Catholic enthusiasm for glorifying God by the arts, dead. See, the same in Holland. You can't find anything to look at in Holland. There's one nice church in southern Holland, which is the Catholic part, that is worth looking at. But Amsterdam and Rotterdam and all of those places, it's all Protestant culture. Now, Holland was established as a Protestant country. See, that was the Spanish Netherlands, and then they revolted. And also northern Germany, Berlin, there are very few examples of any kind of really serious religious art. Whereas, if you look at these at the same time in the Catholic countries, France, Italy, Spain, they continue that Catholic culture and are producing things that are comparable with those of the Middle Ages. Whereas there is still a strong Catholic culture in those countries, even though they are affected to a certain extent by the new thinking. In England, all of the energy goes into people's homes. So if you come to England, the tourists, American tourists, you go and see Highclere, which was that Downton Abbey place, and then you go see these other big, beautiful homes put up by extremely rich people. It's all secular. And so I'm pointing that out, that the mind of Europe, Protestant Europe, went over to the secular. You also saw a great increase in commercialism, mercantilism, the establishment of empire, and all of that, and much more interest in getting money and the various colonies and so forth, enhancing the economic situation of Europe. And there's nothing wrong with that in itself, but there's a question of interest and the degree to which you do that. You see, medieval Europe was not terribly interested in that. It could have been. They were no less intelligent than modern human beings. It could have been, but their mind was on the next world. This world was something to be despised, in the sense that you don't have much attachment to it. It is something passing, where we have our mind on the next world. That is what was medieval Europe, whereas Renaissance Europe and post-Renaissance Europe started to turn and toward thinking about worldly things, human things. You see it you start to see it in 17th century France, for example. Louis XIV built Versailles, and this is his own words, as a new home for the gods. And he himself presented himself as Apollo and appeared in various theatrical productions, even as king, in an Apollo outfit. his whole body in some sort of gold makeup or something like that, and he saw himself as a new Greek god. See, that's totally pagan. If that had been built in the Middle Ages, instead of those statues of the various Greek and Roman gods that you see even today at Versailles, you would have seen saints. And it shows the change. And then you started to see also the building of these big chateaus, instead of the churches. I mean, there are some. But there was you didn't see that in the Middle Ages. If you go to any town in France, for example, old town like Chartres, or any of the old medieval towns, right in the middle is the cathedral. Then around it are some houses that are not bad, but they're nothing extraordinary. You see, you can't find a chateau from the Middle Ages, a sprawling, decorated home. You can't find one of these English homes in the Middle Ages. They just didn't do it. They built castles to protect themselves, but they were not splendorous in any sense of the term, not at all. They were pretty rugged on the inside. So I'm saying that there was a gradual turn toward this world, mercantilism, acquiring riches of this world, and then a lot of territorial disputes, land grabbing, empire building. This was all this world stuff. And so at that time as well, and also with the progress of Protestantism, you had in the 17th century the rise of something called unbelief. And that was people starting to say, well, we question Christianity. It started out that way, and is everything in the Bible really true? And you saw that with Descartes, for example. You saw it in England, a great deal in England, the rise of deism in England. And one of the reasons for that was that intellectual people realized that Protestantism was absurd. That it doesn't make any sense. And they saw that as Christianity, and of course it doesn't make any sense. And so they started to question it. And that gave rise to what we call deism. Don't forget, at the same time you had the rise of Puritanism in this country, which was completely nutty, you might say. Very, very radical in all of its ideas, going around smashing things. I was told in a tour of the Cathedral of Ely that the Puritans did more damage in England than the Reformation did. And we just saw a church in Tewkesbury yesterday where the Lady Chapel, I think was the term, was completely smashed, and nothing was done since. You had to take hammers and smash every single aspect of that altar and the reredos behind the altar. And it was a testimony, and it was all done by Puritans. And it was not even Gloucester, I can't remember one or the other, I saw both yesterday. But so that was another, when they went to Massachusetts, they were kicked out of England, and then they were kicked out of Holland. And they went to Massachusetts, and they were supposed to go to New Jersey, as a matter of fact, but that's another story. But they scolded the Anglicans, who were members of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, because they didn't, they took Christmas as a day off from working, and they scolded them for that because Christmas could not be found in the Bible. And when Cromwell came to power in England, they rejoiced. Wonderful. It was the greatest thing that ever happened. And so they were the radical Protestants. And so they, again, gave Protestantism a very bad name, in the sense that, so England really was and Germany to a great extent, northern Germany, was the beginning of this, or gave birth to the beginning of unbelief, this doubting of Christianity. And that gradually developed into the 18th century Enlightenment, where Catholicism was ridiculed and Voltaire saying awful things, écraser l'infâme, which means destroy the despicable thing, referring to the Catholic Church. And if you read their works, they want to see a transformation of Christianity into a humanist, reasonable religion that everyone would belong to. They say these things. This was their plan, that they can't accept all of these supernatural mysteries. Rather, we want to transform Catholicism. And so you see the roots of it there. And that was very popular in the 18th century. You had the rise of Freemasonry in the 17th century in England. Already Cromwell was dabbling in an early Freemasonry. Then, believe it or not, James II, who was a Catholic, also was a Freemason, early Freemason, because it wasn't formally established until 1717 in London. But he was an early, and he was exiled into France, as you know, the so-called Glorious Revolution, 1688, and led by the Duke of Marlborough, and who's an ancestor of Winston Churchill. I don't know if you know that. But yes, he's from that family. Who ran him out, effectively, and brought in what we call in America a shirt-tail relative, and that was William and Mary. And that was the end of Catholicism in England, because James was trying to re-Catholicize England, but Innocent the 11th told him, "You're going too fast. It's not going to work because you're going too fast." An interesting comment. But he went to France, and he introduced his Freemasonry in France, and that is where you get Scottish Rite, because the Stuarts were Scots. And so that was the Rite Écossais, or the Scottish Rite in France. That's why it was called that. So that's interesting. You see, Freemasonry was not officially condemned by the Catholic Church until the 1730s. See, so there could have been some practice of it without actually its having been condemned. But the cult was something that was very humanist. Masonry was above all religions and took from all religions some sort of wisdom, and so it didn't believe in any of those religions, but was above all of them. See, and some branches of Freemasonry were atheists, particularly in France, but not in England. See, so it had an aspect of a certain religious quality in England. So 1717 is the beginning of Freemasonry, and that whole century was, was characterized by the Enlightenment. You had Immanuel Kant, you had Leibniz, you had in this country David Hume, who was a Scot, but he had a tremendous influence. Earlier on, you had Lord Bolingbroke and Shaftesbury. Bolingbroke was a big influence on Voltaire. Voltaire came to see him and actually lived with him for a while. These people were full of blasphemies against God and everything, you might say even Christian. So there was a very strong influence. Frederick II, mid-1700s, was also one of these enlightened people. He was practically an atheist and very low morals. He had a great influence on Voltaire. Voltaire went and lived with him for a while. And other big names. You had a lot of, it just took off in France. The Enlightenment started in England, I would say, and then just became inflamed in France. France was the principal Catholic country of Europe, the most powerful and the most, I would just say, had the greatest cultural influence in Europe, and very, very prosperous in the 18th century as well. So the fact that it blew up in France was a very bad thing because of its cultural influence. Everybody wanted to be like the French, maybe except the English. But the rest of the continental Europe wanted to be like France, and they all built their palaces like Versailles. Everybody imitated what the French were doing. You know, if you were any kind of an intellectual, you would speak French. The Russian court spoke French, for example. And, it had an enormous influence, and so when that took place in Europe, in France, it just went everywhere because of that. As a matter of fact, when the American colonies declared their independence, all of the young noble leftists went over to the United States at that time, and offered their services to Washington. And so many went over that Washington had to send many of them back because he couldn't even handle them. These were officers in the French army. That's how much they were infected by the liberal ideas. You see, the United States was created sort of as a creature of the Enlightenment. That is, it was the first time in history that you had a nation without a religion. First time in all history. There had never been on the face of the earth a civilization or a nation that did not profess a religion. It was the first time, and all of the ideas of John Locke, especially, who was the mastermind of the ideas of the Glorious Revolution, all of those ideas were taken in by what we call the Founding Fathers. They have a great veneration for John Locke, who believed in total freedom, that you are born free. I don't know if there was a stupid movie about that in the 1960s with a stupid song, but it was about a lion or something. Born free, free as the wind blows, or something like that. And that your freedom is restricted only by the freedom of other people. It's John Locke. See, which is not true. You are born subject to law. You're born subject to the law of God, which is included in the natural law. You're subject to the laws of the nation in which you live. You're subject to your parents' authority. You're not born free. You're never totally free in that sense. Now, human beings are always free in this sense, that no one can force your will. And you might be shocked to hear me say, not even God can force your will. In this sense, that he would have to destroy you. He would have to alter your nature in order to move your will. Because he made your will free. That is, you are totally in control of what you will do. See, so in that sense, it is true that human beings are free, but they're not free in the civil sense, or in the sense that we can do whatever we want, that we are lawless. But this was the philosophy of John Locke, that we are not bound to any laws. And any laws that are made are by the consent of the governed. See, so that is the basis of democracy. See, so you cannot force me to do something unless I agree with it. That's John Locke. All right, he's late 1600s, he died in about 1706, thereabout. And he also, government by the consent of the governed, and the idea of the right of revolution. When government becomes oppressive, you have a right to rise up and overthrow it, the right of revolution. Those ideas were incorporated into the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson, who was practically a worshiper of John Locke. Right? But all of those ideas were prevalent in the Glorious Revolution. And those ideas, that Glorious Revolution was really, it established all of the principles of the American independence. See, that we can overthrow a king if we don't like him, get rid of him. It was also true with Charles I, but it really had more effect in 1688 with the idea of just dumping a king that you don't like. See, a people has a right to do that. That is contrary to Catholic social teaching, Catholic culture, and everything the Catholic Church would say. You cannot, just as you cannot have a lynch mob in the south of the United States, especially with the black race, if they decided that somebody in the town who was a black young man or something, if he did something wrong, they would take him out, judge him, and lynch him. It was a lynch mob. There was no justice. It was just, they decided he had to die. And it was a scandal. And a revolution like that is really no different from a lynch mob. Just to show you, it was only 1/3, for example, in 1776, of the American colonists who were in favor of the independence. 1/3. Another third were loyal, and another third didn't care which way it went. So but then they came together and all that stuff. But my point is that the 18th century was a century of the establishment of this idea of we don't need religion. We can do fine with a religion of reason, and that there should be at least toleration of all religions, and there should be a reform of Christianity to something reasonable that everyone could accept, and which would be effectively a dogmaless humanitarianism. No dogmas, and just making the world a better place to live in, which is exactly the Novus Ordo. See, so you see how it's going with the general trend. Vatican II was convened for aggiornamento. Aggiornamento is an Italian word, it means updating. And the idea was, if you look at the speeches of John the 23rd, was to open the windows of the church and to update the church, adapt it to the modern world, to preserve all of the doctrines, but to express them in a different way, which is typically modernist. In other words, that the formulations made by all of the magisterium of the church is going to change in such a way that we'll say these same things in different ways. See? That will be more, how would you say, edible for the modern society. The idea was to fix up the church in such a way as to make it pleasing to the atheism and modernism and all sorts of worldliness, all of the new philosophies, the existentialism, all of the subjectivist philosophies, the phenomenalism, all of those things to make it pleasing to all of these people who had hated the Catholic Church for centuries. And that they would then embrace the Catholic Church as being wonderful, and everyone would come in and be happy in this changed church. And I remember I lived in the 1960s, and I was a teenager in the 1960s, and there was so much optimism that this Reformed Catholicism would bring in the whole world, that everyone would come flocking to the Catholic Church because it was now taken out of the Middle Ages, and it was transformed into something that would be compatible with the modern world and would conform to the tastes of the modern world. The optimism was not able to be measured. And now we've seen what has happened. This Father de Say, who recently joined us from Novosaro, he said that when he was in the seminary, they told him that you, seminarians, when you're ordained, you will preside over the decline of Catholicism. That's what they told him in the seminary. This was in a very conservative Novosaro seminary, that you will preside over the decline of Catholicism. And there's, I don't know if they're doing the same here, but they're closing down churches a great deal in the United States, selling them off. There's nobody there. And worse than that, they have no priest to put in there. So one priest is running 4 parishes. I know a priest in Germany that was running 4 parishes. So it is a tremendous flop in the sense that it is just not popular. Nobody takes it seriously. The only people that still go are really people my age who knew the old church and who have drilled into them the fact that you should go to church every Sunday. But the young people really want nothing to do with it. They're just not interested in it. And yet there is an interest on the part of young people in what you call conservative Novosaro things. The indult mass, for example, is frequented to a great extent by young people, young families. The Novosaro even made the comment, it is interesting that they can be nostalgic about something they never knew, because they just see that as nostalgia. In fact, it is their way of finding the Catholic faith, because the traditional Mass, even when it's offered in the context of the Novosaro, speaks the Catholic faith. It has a way of just telling you the Catholic faith in some way. It just speaks it. And people see that and they are attached to it. And if you see the pictures of people going there, many of them, I would say most of them, are young families. Because there's something to it. There's belief in God. There's a consistent idea about God and what he should be and what the Catholic Church should be, etc., etc. And that's why Bergoglio wants to shut it down so much. Because there's that inevitable effect of the traditional Mass on people. It teaches them to despise what Vatican II has done, because they see what the Church was through the Mass. So it's an interesting effect of it. But so getting back to the point, so the 1600s and 1700s is a time of tremendous change in Europe. There were the religious wars in the 1500s. France underwent a great deal of religious war. France almost went Protestant, but finally did not. There was the 30 Years' War in Germany, which was actually almost won by the Catholic Austrians. But at the last minute, Cardinal Richelieu, put the French in on the side of the Protestants in order to beat back the the Catholic victors in Germany, now Germany, to beat them back, because he didn't want Habsburgs on the eastern border of France. They already had them on the southern border of France in Spain. Now, Spain had an enormous empire, all Habsburg. That was South America, Mexico, the western United States, an enormous empire. So he's looking at this Habsburg monster and puts Catholic France on the side of the Protestants to achieve a hegemony for France in Europe. And that's exactly what happened. France became the leading country of Europe as a result of that. The Habsburgs were beaten back. And Germany would have been Catholic today if France had not done that. But in any case, so by the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, Europe is split up and Protestantism is injected. So and then the 18th century is the century of the Enlightenment. I'll tell you a few things about the Enlightenment. Incredulism in England, that's another word for unbelief. You had Lord Herbert of Cherbury, I'm going to say, I don't know. We don't know how to pronounce English words. Cherbury, was writing works which called into question the existence of a supernatural religion. He's 1581 to 1648. John Locke, 1632 to 1704, did much to further the ideas of empiricism, which is the same as nominalism, that we can't know anything beyond the senses. David Hume, who was a philosopher in the 18th century, said, when you play billiards, you cannot know if the ball that hits another ball is actually causing it to go the other way. Because you can't see causality. It's true, you can't see it. You can see the effects of causality, but you cannot see causality with your eyes. You can see it with your mind. Anyone in his right mind would know that when the cue ball hits another ball and it goes into the pocket, that the cue ball caused it, and that there was an intelligent force behind it. See, but Hume said no. All you can see is effect. That, well, you know, the one ball hit another ball, and well, it went into the pocket. That's empiricism. And England was always infected with empiricism. I think because of its mercantilism and its desire for money and commerce. It was very much attached to matter, and it loved empiricism. And David Hume was very, very popular for that reason. John Locke also was an empiricist. And so he denied the possibility of any true knowledge, because all you know is what animals know. They see things happen, but they don't know causality, for example. And thereby ruined the possibility of belief in a supernatural religion. See, John Locke said we should all act according to reason, and if we all act according to right reason, then we'll all be fine. Government will be good, life will be good, which denies the effects of original sin. See, original sin gives us a penchant for evil. It's all around us today. You can see why do people act this way? Why are people trying, men trying to be women, women trying to be men? It's sick, and yet that's what this idea causes. You leave people to their own reason, they are going to descend into savagery. And the reason why there were savages in the world was because they were not ever evangelized. They never received the wisdom of the gospel and the discipline of obeying the law of God. Europe brought it to them. Now Europe is being fried for having brought the faith to the savages. In California, the Franciscan monks discovered that the Indians did not know how to till the soil. They also wore no clothes whatsoever. That was true also in Canada when the French Jesuits went over. During the summer, nobody wore any clothes. During the winter, they lived in longhouses where they defecated on the floor. This was during the whole winter. And where there was free love among all of the ladies and the men. And it was all one big room like this. And Jean de Brébeuf, he went out to, this is up by Georgian Bay, up by Lake Huron. He had to live in that longhouse during the whole winter. And winter is long in Canada. And he was horrified. But that was their, and then they would also eat their enemies. If their enemy was brave, they would cut his heart out and eat it. And that's what happened to that Jean de Brébeuf. They saw that he was brave in his tortures, so they pulled out his heart and ate it. I mean, this is... And then when John Paul II went to Canada, he apologized for the Jesuit missionaries. They brought the Catholic Europe, and even Protestant Europe, having benefited ultimately from the faith originally, brought civilization to the rest of the world. You know, and people, there were cannibals in Mexico, cannibals in Peru, and they were all cannibals. And the reason that you have people descending into savagery is because they are detached from any sort of civilization, and the effects of original sin just multiply until they are acting practically like animals. That's the effects of original sin on the human race. We descend into something practically like animals. But you can do worse than that by getting your mind so mixed up by all of these crazy ideas. You could be living in a place of high civilization and in a way be worse off than the savages, because at least the savages know the difference between a man and a woman. Our modern society doesn't know that. It's sick and it's weird. You can't even express it. It's so bizarre. So there's an intellectual savagery as well. Oliver Cromwell, 1599 to 1658, he was a Puritan rebel who had a particular hatred for Catholics. He would go over to Ireland and gather all the Catholics into churches and set them on fire. Cromwell. So. And in France, you had Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a nut, Montesquieu, very, very influential in modern political thought, D'Alembert, who was, he was in charge of the encyclopedia, Diderot, who helped in the encyclopedia. You had the Illuminati in Germany, founded by Adam Weishaupt, who were radicals in this movement of unbelief. This was all going on in 18th century Europe. There was, in France, even under Louis XV, the middle part of the 18th century, there was a very strong anti-monarchical and anti-Catholic feeling among the nobles and the bourgeoisie, the middle class. The lower classes, not so much. But that level, and even among the high clergy, the cardinals, etc., when Louis XVI, the Cardinal of Paris, died, Archbishop of Paris died in the 1780s, 1781, I think it was. See, the King of France had the ability to name the bishops in France, and the Rome would generally approve. So they suggested to him the Archbishop of Toulouse, de Bérène, for Paris. And he said, well, I think it would be appropriate if the Archbishop of Paris believed in God. That's how bad it was. the high clergy were very corrupted. They came from the nobility. All of the ideas of the French Revolution, it came primarily from the upper classes, educated classes, not from the lower people. They went, yes, they had a famine and all, but it was mostly that anti-monarchical idea was it was very much alive. There was a person called Albert Pike, who was a Freemason and a reputed Satanist. He was an American. And he said, the secret movers of the French Revolution had sworn to overturn the throne and the altar upon the tomb of Jacques de Molay. Jacques de Molay was the Templar who was burned by Philip the Fair. When Louis XVI was executed, half the work was done, and thenceforward the army of the Temple was to direct all of its efforts against the Pope. So it saw the execution of Louis XVI as the Freemasonic response to the burning of Jacques de Molay, the Templar. So you had the effect of all of this enlightenment, and I use that term very, very sarcastically, was the French Revolution. The French Revolution was put into social and political statement or political effect all of the rot of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment. And it is a turning point for the entire world, was the French Revolution. All of the 19th century, the history of the 19th century in all countries is simply summarized by applying the French Revolution to the old order that was left over from the Middle Ages in all the countries. So that is, I mean, you can go on and on about the French Revolution, but it influenced, it gave us the socialist state, it gave us the totalitarian state. It's all in the principles of the French Revolution. It gave us the naturalistic notion of man, the rights of man, the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Somebody in the revolution said, should we talk about the rights of God? And that was, of course, quashed. And revolutionism, the fact that you can rise up, and France has had more revolutions since the original revolution. It has changed regimes so many times, although the French monarchy lasted from the time of Charlemagne, even Clovis, which was many, many years, many centuries. The cult of liberty came from it. That idea of Locke, that we are free as birds and nobody can tell us what to do unless we accept it. That all came out of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment. And that really defines the modern world. That is the modern world. Religious liberty, that there's no one true religion. All of it is the same. It doesn't matter what religion you belong to. And that religious liberty dictates an atheist state. See, the state cannot espouse any one religion, so it has to be effectively atheist, which is true of practically every government in the world. So one of these times I'll give you a whole outline of the French Revolution. So the 19th century, as I said, was the application of all of this, what was wrapped up in the French Revolution, the application of it into all of Europe. Napoleon went out and spread it all over Europe. He said, we have this mission to spread it around Europe. So that's why he even attacked Spain. Spain was no threat to him, but he wanted to bring the revolution to Spain. He had this idea that all of Europe had to be revolutionized. He wanted to attack England, and that's why he sold Louisiana for something like $15 million to the United States, which was a ridiculous price even at that time. But he wanted the money to build a navy to attack England. But he gave it up because he said they have the wall of wood, meaning the British Navy. He wouldn't do it. He had it all prepared on the northern shore of France, but pulled back, he said, not possible. So the British Navy had quite a reputation. So when they lost Trafalgar, he said, well, I can't be everywhere. That was his comment. So anyway, you had revolutions in 1848. Gradually through the 19th century, you had this expansion of the ideas of the French Revolution throughout Europe. Then you had the revolutions in France in 1870, 1871. The Third Republic, which repressed the Catholic faith terribly in France. You had the Kulturkampf in the German Empire, which repressed Catholicism. You had revolutions in Italy, which by Freemasons, Garibaldi, which repressed the Catholic faith in Italy. Spain and Portugal were also subject to a lot of Freemasonic governments, which repressed the Catholic faith. And then Great Britain, on the other hand, emancipated Catholics in 1829 over the objections of George IV, who hated Catholics, but at the suggestion of none other than Wellington. Wellington was the one that pushed it through, the emancipation. But the emancipation was done on the principle of liberalism, that it doesn't matter. And it got pushed through by Daniel O'Connell, who was an Irish liberal. And the principle was liberalism, that you shouldn't care. That Anglicanism should not be so established that it excludes Catholicism. That all religions should be able to function anymore. And that makes for an atheistic state, because it cannot profess. Now, technically, the King of England is the head of the Church of England, but I don't have to tell you about that, I don't think. So, then you have World War I, which brought down all of the empires that did have some sort of established religion. It brought down the Austrian Empire, the German Empire, which had an established religion of, at least in some parts of it, of Lutheranism, but also Catholicism in Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg. Austria was Catholic, professed Catholicism. Austria-Hungary, and even the Ottoman Empire, which professed Islam. All of those, and the Russian Empire, which professed Russian Orthodoxy, all of them had established state religions. They all came down. They were all empires, and they all came down. And the idea was that, as Woodrow Wilson said, it was Christianity failed in uniting people. Now we're going to do it. Woodrow Wilson was. Christianity has not succeeded in uniting peoples. We will succeed, I hope, by the League of Nations. See, so that was the beginning of putting a world government together. See, as you know, that was a complete flop. And also the U.S. Senate would not accept the League of Nations. So that was his baby. He was a dreamer. And that was his baby, the League of Nations. He goes back to the U.S. and the Senate says, no, we won't. The Senate has to ratify treaties. No. So he had a stroke after that. But the United States was never part of it. But as you know, the whole thing was a big mess and a failure. So then the 20th century is, you have the rise of Nazism, you have the rise of fascism, which are left-wing totalitarian states. You have the rise of communism, also left-wing totalitarian states. and liberalism in places like England, France, the United States, there is nothing left of the original Christendom. And this is the modern world that Vatican II wants to relate to. All of this that I have mentioned in a very general way is what Vatican II wants to relate to. The Catholic Church took the position before Vatican II of building a wall around itself and making sure that it was not infected by any of those ideas. And so it condemned religious liberty, it condemned all of the trends in the modern society, communism, socialism, condemned all of that. Modernism, modern philosophy, the condemnation of the, what was that, Notre Chartre Apostolique, what was that, France, the movement in France, anyway.
Sion.
Sion in France. Condemned that because it was full of all of these liberal principles. And so, but Pius X was considered to have gone too far, and by a lot of the ecclesiastics, and so they elected Benedict XV, who came in as an anti-Pius X policy holder. In other words, that I will go softer on modernism, I will go softer on questions of the modern world, etc. And then you had Pius XI, who followed more or less the same line, Pius XII, who followed it to a great extent. And during that period, from the Benedict XV to 1958, we had a rise of all of these prelates appointed who were tainted with modernism. Nearly all of the bishops at Vatican II were appointed by Pius XII. And they were tainted with modernism. And that's what happened, was that the idea was that we're going to transform Catholicism to please this movement in the modern world that would like to see it transformed into some sort of humanistic, dogmaless religion. It's exactly what it is. If you hear Bergoglio talk, everything he says, he never says anything pious, practically never. It's always climate, it's wars, something human, some human problem that he perceives or which is real. And dogmaless. You see, it doesn't matter what you believe. Yes, they have dogmas written down, but it doesn't matter what you believe. In the Novus Ordo, you can believe anything you want. We have a priest who's studying with us, was a former Jesuit. He said they don't believe in transubstantiation. You know, there's a total lack of faith. See, so it has become dogmaless, not on paper, but in practice. It's a dogmaless religion. And with a worship that is equally dogmaless, that is so, as we would say, vanilla flavored, that it is just sort of some sort of generic Christian worship. He said, this former Jesuit, I didn't know that the Mass was a sacrifice. He's 60 years old and was in the Jesuits for about 30 years. I didn't know that the Mass was a sacrifice until about 2 years ago. Jesuit trained. I mean, it's far worse than we know. Another Novus Ordo priest told me that the nuns in his parish wouldn't go to Mass even on Sunday because they were into witchcraft. It's true. They were witches. And they wouldn't go to Mass even on Sunday. The nuns in the parish. That's how bad it is. Those are just a few examples of it. It goes on and on. You know? So that is the deep roots of Vatican II. It goes back to the Renaissance, comes through the Reformation, then the French Revolution, and up to the modern world. The Church wants to please the modern world, the Novus Ordo. Wants to please the modern world, and that's what the modern world is. It's and modernism was just a way of applying modern philosophy and modern thinking to Catholic dogma. And that it didn't matter what you believed, everything was in you, and you have an experience of God, and that's personal to you. That's modernism. That's exactly what you have today. So that's the roots of Vatican II. This transformation of Catholicism. Catholicism being the last bastion against the Antichrist, the anti-Christian world. And it had to go. And they tried to tear it down, but it wouldn't be torn down. So they had to get into it and transform it. Thank you for listening. Take questions. He's giving me signals as if I lip read. If you want to take questions, yes, I'll take questions. Right.
Thank you.
Your Excellency, so you spoke about the principles which led to modernism and then which led to Vatican II. To what extent does Your Excellency think that those principles are present in semi-traditionalist groups like the Indult or the Societies of High September? To what extent may they influence their praxis?
Well, I would call Indult High Church Novus Ordo. I mean, it's the same thing as High Church Anglicanism. They are Novus Ordites who love the ceremony, and as you may notice that they do everything splendidly, just the way High Anglicans do. You know, the High Anglicans do Catholic liturgy better than Catholics do, you know, and they really do it up. And so these people, everything is splendid. That's all they have, you know, but I would say, nonetheless, the people are there in order to be Catholic. They see a problem. They don't like the Novus Ordo. They probably would never go to it. And there's a desire to be Catholic, and they see continuity in it. So in that sense, it's not all bad. But you know, to be attached to be in the same ecclesiastical boundaries as the Novus Ordo or the Big Tent, you know, where you have dancing girls on this side and then the traditional mass on this side, makes no sense whatsoever and is going nowhere. It is not any kind of solution to the problem. It is, a matter of fact, it in a sense distracts from the problem. You can somehow be Catholic in that context. So, you know, there's two sides to it, you might say, some aspects which are positive, you might say, but fundamentally it's negative. SSPX, again, they entertain, they have since their inception, practically with a few interruptions, this idea of being part of the Novus Ordo, being a branch of the Novus Ordo, functioning under the auspices of the Novus Ordo, and because of that, they have been quite liberalized, from what I hear, as their attitudes and the things that they accept that we would never accept. Marriage annulments, their policy on marriage annulments is that they fundamentally accept the Novus Ordo marriage annulment, but they want to review it to make sure it's okay. But they see in them the power to annul. And their position is objectively schismatic, that you can resist a Roman pontiff on matters that pertain to the universal discipline and doctrine of the Catholic Church. That is schismatic. It is said to be schismatic precisely by Pius IX. Explicitly, he said it. And talking about some Eastern Rite people who were trying to do precisely that, resisting him and all. And he said that's schismatic. So their position is objectively schismatic. But again, these are people who want to be Catholics. That's why they're there. You know, they see tradition there. They see continuity there. And also, because it's so big and has all of the services, it's a full service type of thing, you might say, nuns and brothers and priests and schools. And, it is a replacement, in a way, for the Catholic Church, and that attracts people. But I compare it to something like the TGV or one of these very fast trains, beautiful, first class, that goes very fast, very nice, but in the wrong direction. In other words, what do you praise? Do you praise the big organization that they have made, or do you condemn the fact that it's going in the wrong direction? And at the next stop, when the doors open, it's the Novus Ordo. That's the way I described it. You know, so, but they don't entertain, I don't think, any hope of reconciliation with Bergoglio. But Bergoglio doesn't have to all together.
Your Excellency, as you notice, I'm from Africa.
Yes.
So I don't think back in Africa we have few Catholics. Very few Catholics.
You're in Nigeria, though, aren't you?
Yeah, in Nigeria.
Isn't that, the southern part is fairly Catholic, isn't it?
Yeah, it's only in Nigeria that we have a true priest.
Yeah, you're talking about Africa in general. I see.
And the only reason I'm here is because of the kind of parents I had. Because Novus Ordo was tradition to us. growing
Yes.
up.
Yes.
So my parents, my father, for example, knew about Freemasons and all that, just like you have
Yes.
said in this lecture. So when he was dying, when he was about 78, he started telling us, his children, that this is not under the Catholic Church. In the whole of my village, we were the first to recognize the Novus Ordo for what it is.
Yes.
So my question is, Your Excellency, I'm building a family. I don't know if I'm alone in this question. I call ourselves the unfortunate parents that want to train their kids, sticking to the right Catholic Church. The question is, how do we parents, get our children to follow in that the same direction? In the sense that every Sunday we don't go to Mass because the Mass is not available. There is no sense of Catholic tradition around the children. When we were growing up, we used to go to Blocco Zori, there's Mass every Sunday, although Novus Ordo. But now, there's no valid priest for Masses every Sunday. And there's no Catholic lifestyle. So
Well,
what do
let me
you
answer your
advise?
question.
Yes.
You have to, in your home, make up for the Catholic lifestyle or culture that they would have by living next door to the church. Because your home has to become a very Catholic home with public Catholic prayers, public devotions, Catholic discipline. And Nigerians discipline their children very well.
Yeah.
I noticed that. That's true, they do. They do. Because I know that from our Nigerian seminarians, and they were well raised too. Nigeria, there's no nonsense. So but you have to make up for that, and the fact that you are doing so much for that, they will see that what they ought to be. The home teaches the child far more efficaciously than church or school or any other influence. That only puts the icing on the cake, so to speak. What you do at home, your Catholic home, is the most influential thing on your children. The way you act, and especially the father of the family. If you have a strong Catholic father, because the father, despite what anybody might say, the feminists, the man by nature has the authority. Just by nature, he does. And the children look to the father. Many times the father is not very religious, the mother is, because women tend to be more pious than men. But that ruins nothing against the women, but if he is not the leader of the Catholic faith in his home, in all respects, piety and discipline, doctrine, then it will fail. So it's mostly on you. And a strong Catholic father who gives an example to his children of piety and doctrine, and the fact that you only go to Mass occasionally is in a way good, that they have to suffer in order to practice their faith. That's good. It's true. As we don't have the faith, we don't have the Catholic Church next door. But think of people even in normal times who lived in the Yukon. They only saw priests maybe once in a quarter. cars. I'm talking about northern Canada, and a lot of people moved up there for gold. But in certain remote parts of the world, priests just didn't get there. Even in Montana, which is the northwest of the United States, they would see the priest. They told me about once a month. This was in the 1930s. Once a month, and they would have to drive a horse cart down to get him, which was about maybe 20 miles away, and that would take a long time on a horse, and bring him up, and he would say Mass. It is not unheard of that we are without the Mass, or that the Mass is sparse. But struggling for your faith is very, very effective when the children see their parents doing that. So I would say that you have actually more opportunity to inculcate the faith than you would have had, say, before the council. Because people became lax and it was easy. Struggling and effort makes for that. So I wouldn't worry about it, but it balls in your court. You're the father.
Thank you.
Yes.
Monsignor, could you possibly explain the Church's rules on lifting of ecclesiastical penalty, particularly around extreme unction, and who can deliver the question I asked you in the car yesterday about, if you were to go to, say, a priest who is in, a conservative Novus Ordo for dying, or, for sacraments. Could you talk about that, please?
Just trying to clarify your question.
So I asked you particularly, we've had some differing advice over the years about whether you can go to say, because obviously SSPX is everywhere here, and we may not always have a priest, somebody's in danger of death.
Okay.
That's
Well, the church says even, in danger of death, any priest validly ordained can be called for last sacraments, for penance. In other words, if he is Catholic, he can give all the last sacraments. If he is non-Catholic, say Greek Orthodox, he can only give penance. But you're not obliged to call someone who is not Catholic. Now, SSPX, for all of their foibles, I would not call them non-Catholics. In other words, they could give all the sacraments. They mean well, and yes, they have mistakes in their theological thinking, but they have no intention of being outside the Catholic Church. They want to be Catholic, etc. And the faith tolerates errors in the sense that errors that in good faith. It tolerates that. In other words, where you just don't know any better. And I would say, to a certain extent, that's true about them. I won't get into that, but they are Catholics, and they're Catholic priests, I would say. They can be called in danger of death. But that doesn't mean that on a regular basis you could go to their masses, because they are unicum, which means that they declare themselves to be in communion with Bergoglio, who cannot be the true Pope. And if you declare yourself in union with him, you are implicitly stating that the religion that he promulgates is Catholicism, which is very seriously wrong. And also, it means that the Mass that you are attending is schismatic because he doesn't approve of it. If he is the Pope, that's a schismatic Mass. If he is not the Pope, it's a schismatic Mass. It's true. I mean, it's no matter which way you go with him, it's something that is not part of the church, objectively. See, so yes, so that's, but you could call a Greek Orthodox, he won't come. The Greek Orthodox hate the Catholics. He wouldn't come, but you could. Yes.
Also, in the light of the news this week, could you talk about the implications of the Novus Ordo bishop blessing the Holy Christmas on Maundy Thursday?
It's totally in accordance with their theology. When I talked to Archbishop Lefebvre personally in the 1970s, he said he considered the new rite of ordination to be dubious and the rite of consecration of bishops to be invalid. And I said, you mean it's doubtful? He said, no, it's invalid. It's a quote. I was in his office. He told me this. And he told me the reasons for it. And so this was after the suppression of a cone first in 1974. They wanted to suppress a cone, and then they suppressed the SSPX in 1975. So from 75 to 78, he was very much anti-Novus Ordo, and very hard line against the Novus Ordo. Then in 1978, he was hugged by JP2. And that started the whole process again of the possibility of a reconciliation with the modernists. And that's when everything changed. So in the past, he had gone around France redoing confirmations, which he considered doubtful or even invalid. That stopped. He would reordain priests, stopped, unless they had scruples about it, and then he would do it. But he did not insist that they be reordained. Then finally in 1983, he told me the new rite of ordination is valid, because I brought up to him, how can you have anything to do with the Novus Ordo when you said that their episcopate is invalid? He says, well, now it's valid, and apparently it's valid. And he pointed to Father Schmidberger, who was in the room, and he said, yes, it's Eastern Rite. And we know, right, research of Father Cicada, yes, it's Eastern Rite. It was a rite, the formula is a rite that, it comes from a rite of the installation of a patriarch in the Eastern Rite. A patriarch who was already consecrated a bishop and just made a patriarch. It's like an honorary thing. That was it. Because the rite, the actual essential words talk about founding churches and doing things that pertain to jurisdiction. Whereas the traditional formula has to do with the perfection of the priesthood, the highest level of priesthood. Two different entirely. And that business of jurisdiction is entirely in accordance with Vatican II, which would take me about half an hour to explain. But that is the, so now they're on that path. I mean, they're saying he's a valid bishop. We of course would say he's invalid, but so you can't negotiate with the Vatican if you're saying that their sacraments are all invalid.
So the effect of the oil Monsignor not being properly consecrated, that would render the sacrament invalid that they were used in.
Right, it would be like using local corn oil or something like that. In other words, just vegetable oil. No, it would be invalid. So, but again, it's an effect of their policies. And that opens the door to that bishop's, or that Novus Ordo bishop, doing ordinations or even a consecration. It opens the door to it. Why not? He's traditional and he's valid. Well, why not? See? So that is very indicative of who they are and where they're going.
Thank you, Monsignor.
Yes.
Your Excellency, would you say that with regard to theological aberrations before Vatican II, the overemphasis of things like the goodwill of some Protestants, the invisible ignorance of some Protestants, and the idea of some theologians that they can be saved without the faith, did that in any way lead to the explosion of ecumenism after the Council?
Well, there's a lot of that in your question. The common teaching of the Church is that those who are in invincible ignorance concerning the true faith are not held accountable by God for their infidelity because of their invincible ignorance. Invincible ignorance means ignorance that cannot be overcome by ordinary means. Right? That's Pisonite. So that did not in any way contribute to ecumenism. St. Ambrose said that. St. Augustine said that. St. Thomas Aquinas said it. St. Robert Bellarmine said it. St. Alphonsus Liguori said it. I mean, you have a lineup of people who said the same thing. There's nothing modernist about that, because God does not condemn people for sins that they commit in ignorance. If you were to shoot a cow out there, if you shot a man thinking that he was a cow because you were nearsighted or something, you did it in ignorance. Morally, you're absolved because you did it in absolute ignorance. See, now legally you might, but morally, there's no sin there. See? So the invincible ignorance thing is not something new, and it's not something that affects Catholicism. I don't know of any traditional theologian that would say that you cannot be saved without the virtue of faith. That you can be saved without the virtue of faith. No one ever said that. So you need supernatural faith in order to, and you must believe certain things. And that is disputed by theologians, how much you must believe of the Catholic faith. What articles are necessary? That's disputed, how much. But they all said you must believe certain articles of the Catholic faith. So that's nothing new. No, the ecumenism didn't come out of that. It came out of this idea that it came out of modernism, that religion is an entirely personal, interior thing, and dogma is really an expression of what you have experienced of God. So that ruins dogma, just destroys it. See, so it came out of that. It really didn't. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
May I ask a follow-up question?
Yes.
So, I was wondering because a lot of people in the preceding centuries, before the Second Vatican Council, would say that many Protestants are in good faith and not like the so-called reformers and so on. Maybe that idea would lead them to think, oh well, now I guess we can worship with them and do all of this stuff.
Well, I would say, I grew up in the 1950s, and that's when dinosaurs roamed the earth, you know? and there was none of that. The Catholic Church protected all of its faithful from Protestantism by various organizations. You could, the athletics and this, that, and the other. Everything was Catholic this, Catholic that, Catholic Lawyers Association, Catholic Doctors. It was very protective of the. I could say that in the 1950s, which was pretty late, and there was no idea of. We were taught that the Catholic Church is the one true faith, outside of which there was no salvation. We were taught that as kids, and that's why I reacted to Vatican II right away. I was 14 years old when the first changes came into the Mass. And I remember walking home that day, saying to myself, "There's something Protestant about the Mass." So I was the product of the Catholicism of that time, and it was abhorrent to me that there should be anything Protestant in the Mass. So I don't think you could accuse it of that. I don't think so.
Thank you, Your Excellency.
Because I have a question from the live stream from Novus Ordo. The question is, if I choose the sedevacantist position, am I not leaving the Church of Rome and being separated from channels of grace and contributing to further destruction instead of healing the church from within?
Well, that is an extrinsic argument, first of all. The central question is that man the Pope or not? All right? Our argument is that it is impossible that he be the Pope for this reason, that he has promulgated to the whole church a religion that is not in continuity with Roman Catholicism. The proof of it is that the traditionalists are resisting him in that. That's practically the definition of it, that they are rejecting the Novus Ordo. see, except for the indult people. So is it Roman Catholicism or not? That is the central question. And all other questions are answered by the answer to that question. If it is Roman Catholicism in continuity, we all should accept it and break up the whole traditional movement. If it is not Roman Catholicism, then it is a defection from it. And if he is promulgating that defection, it is impossible that he have the authority of Christ to rule the church. Impossible. Because otherwise you have to associate defection with the Catholic Church, which is against the dogma of indefectibility. So an organized resistance to the Novus Ordo dictates necessarily, through all of that logic, that it is impossible that he be the Pope. See, so the question is not whether we can, work within and change things. That is extrinsic to the question of whether that man is the Pope or not. Okay, so I would just say he's got to settle in his mind whether the Novus Ordo is Roman Catholicism. If it is, go to it. Why have even the traditional Mass? If the new Mass is Roman Catholicism, then go to it. Save your soul in the Novus Ordo. That's the question here. It's the fundamental question. Everything else is extrinsic to it. Any other consideration is totally extrinsic and really non-applicable.
Any other questions?
You have
My lord, this might sound like a bit of a slippery question. What
That's the
what exactly does it mean for a church for a mass to be, on the question of the Unicum Mass, what does it mean for a mass to be within the church? And by that I mean, the Pope, as author of the liturgy, has the executive authority to edit the prayers. He might do so foolishly or imprudently, but it's within his authority to change the prayers for the Mass as long as it's not in a way that's contradictory to the faith. Now, would it be within the power of the Pope to, let's say, take the Unicum prayer and excise that from the canon? Would he be stripping from the Mass something that is essential to the nature of the Mass? And if he were to do so, as you say, again putting questions of imprudence to one side, would that render the Unicum no longer an issue, my lord?
Well, whether that prayer is there or not is immaterial in this sense that, for example, the Greeks just put his name on the triptychs and then read the triptychs at a certain point. So it can be done in various ways, but even if there was none of that, the Mass, in order to be Catholic, must be approved by and under the authority of the Roman Pontiff. If it isn't, it is a Mass outside the Church. And St. Thomas says that it does not give grace. So Mass is offered outside the Church to not give grace, according to St. Thomas Aquinas. All right, so it has to have the approval of the Roman Pontiff, the local bishop, and the priest offering it must be empowered by the local bishop, because the Mass is the principal offerer of the Mass is our Lord Jesus Christ. And so the hierarchy comes right down from him, the Pope, the bishops. It is an act of the whole church. Every Mass is an act of the whole church. It's not like a miraculous medal devotion, you see. It's a universal act of the whole church. So no matter whether he's named that's there or not, or if he does not authorize that Mass, it is a Mass outside the church.
Thank you, my lord.
Your Excellency, my question touches on that because a friend once told me that the reason why he was in an SSPS, so he's now in said vacancy position platform. So he told me the reason why he left the SSPS is because the name of John Paul II at the time was being mentioned in the Mass, which means having the name in the Mass means that every member of the SSPS or other endowed groups pray for the intentions of the Pope at the Mass. Would that be correct to say so?
Well, what we're saying isn't the Pope. But the intentions of the Pope are you see that for indulgences, you have to pray for the intentions of the Pope, are the automatic intentions that go with his office, which are the propagation of the faith, the alleviation of the miseries of the poor and the extirpation of heresy, those three things. So when you're praying, if you see that at the end of a prayer, you have to pray for the intentions of the Pope, you're praying for those things. Because the Pope, by his very nature, must intend those things. You see, if he doesn't intend them, he's not the Pope. Just like if you were made the captain of a ship, you have to intend the good of that ship. But if you said, well, we're going to go in circles or something, or we're going to put it up on the rocks, immediately officers will come and get you and say, please come with us. We're going to take the ship, guide it ourselves. There's authority has an object. It has the object of the good of the society over which it is placed. And there are certain essential goods that the Pope must intend in order to be Pope. See, so the intentions of the Pope, if he is promulgating a false religion, it all comes back to that question, then it is impossible that he be the Pope. And yes, by saying his name, you are really approving of the false religion that he's promulgating. Yes?
Your Excellency, related to my previous question, Your Excellency said that the idea that no one can be saved without the virtue of faith is universal among theologians, but you could correct me if I'm wrong, but for those who said that profession of the Catholic faith or explicit belief in the Catholic faith wasn't necessary for salvation, do you think that idea would have softened people to the idea of the Catholic faith being the only true religion, to the point that we would see the things said in Nostra Aetate being widely accepted?
All I can say is that it didn't. There's a big difference between mixing religions and making a generic Christianity, which is Novus Ordo, and saying that invincible ignorance excuses you from the sin of infidelity, because by its very definition, invincible ignorance means that you are ignorant through no fault of your own of what you really should be believing. That's night and day. That never offended the Catholic faith. It never softened anybody that I know of, there are very strong theologians, very super orthodox theologians who defended just what I just said, like Gary Willigrange and Bio and all of these great theologians of the 20th century, 19th century, as I said, doctors of the church. No one ever saw that as incompatible with Catholicism. You see, so I don't think it's the question came up when the church became very missionary in the 19th century. What is the condition of peoples who have never heard of the gospel, etc.? And that's when the question really presented itself. But God does not condemn anybody who commits a sin in invincible ignorance, which means ignorance that cannot be overcome by normal means. Invincible ignorance means that you did not take the trouble to find out. For example, a surgeon who says, I know I have to take off one of these legs, but I don't know which one it is. Well, I'll take a guess. That's invincible ignorance. Because he has to find out.
Those who are here, you'll be able to ask His Excellency a question privately after we wrap up the live stream. Last question from the live stream is, if I'm the only member of my family that accepts sedevacantism, should I stay and help my family, or should I run and find a Catholic community?
Well, is he the head of the family, or is it?
He doesn't specify.
If he's the head of the family, he has to stay with the family and do the best he can. He can't run away, obviously. If he's a child or something like that, or a grown child, then it might be a good idea to practice the faith in a place where it's easy to have the Mass. It depends on his condition in life. can't really answer that question.
All right, thank you for your time, Excellency.
Okay, thank you.